The fire was doing that old familiar thing, breathing in and out, as if it had lungs hidden under the coals. Every now and then, a pine knot would pop and send a small spray of sparks upward, where they climbed into the dark and vanished like they'd found a secret door in the sky. We were camped on Pineglass Ridge because we didn't know any better. That's the honest truth. We weren't chasing legends. We weren't trying to be brave. We were just tired of the city, tired of screens, tired of the kind of noise you don't notice until you finally step away from it. My friend Owen had picked the trail. He always picked the trail. He had that quiet confidence people get when they've read too many topo maps and watched too many hiking videos at 2 a.m. He said Pineglass Ridge was underrated. He said the views were wide and the nights were clean. He said we'd sleep like stones. We started late, which is how most trouble begins. Nothing dramatic, just a small decision made with a shrug. The sun had already started to tilt when we reached the first climb. By the time we hit the ridgeline, the light was turning honey gold and the shadows were stretching long enough to trip over. The air up there felt different. Not colder, exactly. Cleaner, like someone had washed the world and hung it out to dry. We found a flat patch of ground just off the trail, a place that looked like it had held tents before. The grass was pressed down in a few spots. A ring of stones sat half hidden under needles and leaves. Someone had camped here and tried to leave no trace, but the mountain always remembers. We pitched the tent. We gathered wood. We lit the fire. And that's when we noticed the lantern. It wasn't hanging from a branch or sitting in the fire ring. It was set a little ways off, on a smooth rock that looked almost placed. An old metal lantern with a glass belly, the kind that belonged in a museum or in your grandfather's garage. It was unlit, no flame, no glow, just there. Owen walked over and crouched beside it. Weird, he said, like he was inspecting an animal track. Maybe someone forgot it. I didn't touch it. I don't know why. Some objects have a gravity to them, like you can feel a story in them and you're not sure you want to be part of it. The lantern looked patient, like it had been waiting longer than we could imagine. There was no note, no name scratched in the metal, just a small symbol stamped near the base, a circle with a short line through it, like a match or a tiny road. We shrugged it off. Of course we did. That's another way most trouble begins. We said, huh? And then we turned back to the fire, because the fire was warm and the night was coming on. We ate from metal bowls. We drank lukewarm coffee. We talked about small things, work nonsense, the price of groceries, the kind of chatter people use to convince themselves everything is normal. But every time the wind moved through the trees, it brought a sound that didn't fit. Not a howl, not a scream, nothing like that. It was softer, a faint clink, like metal tapping stone. Owen heard it too. He looked into the dark beyond the firelight, listening. Probably someone else camping, he said, but his voice wasn't fully convinced. The sound came again. Clink, pause, clink. Always from the same direction. The lantern's direction. We let it go for a while. We tried to ignore it. The fire kept talking in its own language, and the trees above us whispered, and our eyes started to feel heavy. It should have been easy to sleep. It should have been. Then, sometime after midnight, the lantern lit itself. I didn't see it ignite. One moment the rock was dark, the next it held a small amber glow, steady, calm, not flickering like a candle. It wasn't bright enough to light the whole campsite, but it was bright enough to be unmistakable. Owen sat up so fast, his sleeping bag rasped like sandpaper. "Okay," he whispered. "Nope. Nope." I stared at the lantern, and my first thought was stupid. Maybe it has one of those motion sensors. Maybe it's modern. Maybe it's battery-powered. But it didn't look modern. It looked old in a way that wasn't just style. Old like something that had lived a long time in weather and smoke and hands. The glow held steady. The clinking stopped. And then, very clearly, a voice came from beyond the lantern, low and slow, like it didn't want to wake the forest. "Don't move," it said. Owen's eyes went wide. He mouthed, "Bear?" I listened harder. The voice didn't sound panicked. It didn't sound threatening. It sounded tired, like someone who'd said those words many times before. "Stay where you are," the voice repeated. And then it added something that made my skin prickle. "The ridge is open tonight." Owen and I didn't answer. We didn't move. We just listened to our own breathing, loud in the quiet. The lantern's glow warmed the rock like a small sunrise trapped in glass. And in the thin slice of light between trees, I saw a figure standing still as a fence post. A person, maybe. Tall, wearing something dark, with shoulders squared against the wind. The figure didn't step closer. It didn't wave. It didn't do anything dramatic. It simply waited, as if it expected us to understand. Morning came gently, like it was trying not to disturb anything. The sky turned from deep blue to pale, and the frost in the grass melted into tiny beads of water. For a while, I convinced myself the night had been a half-dream, something my brain stitched together from wind and firelight and the unfamiliar shapes of trees. But when I crawled out of the tent, the lantern was still there on the rock, unlit now, silent, ordinary, if you ignored how wrong it felt. Owen came out behind me, blinking hard. "Tell me you saw that," he said. "I saw it," I answered, and the fact that my voice sounded normal made me uneasy. It should have sounded shaken. It should have sounded like someone who'd met a stranger in the dark. Owen walked a careful circle around the lantern as if it might bite. "So what?" he said. "There's just a lantern that turns on by itself, and a guy in the woods telling us not to move. That's not a thing." We made breakfast in a quiet mood. Oatmeal, dried fruit, the practical food people eat when they want to pretend the world is simple. The sun warmed the ridge enough to make the previous night feel distant. The birds were loud. The trees looked less like silhouettes and more like living plants, full of needles and texture. Daylight has a way of making fear look foolish. But the lantern didn't care about daylight. When Owen finally touched it, he did it like a man disarming a trap. He lifted it slowly by the handle. The metal was cold, even in the sun. He turned it over. No battery compartment. No switch. No obvious wick. And the symbol near the base, the small circle and line, was scratched deeper than I'd noticed, as if someone had traced it with a knife again and again. There were tracks in the dirt around the rock. Not fresh footprints, not animal prints, just a worn place where someone had stood many times, shifting weight, waiting. Owen set the lantern back down with a soft clink that made both of us flinch. We should have packed up and left. That would have been the sensible thing. That's what most people would do. Walk away from the weirdness and go back to their lives. But Owen has a mind that hates loose ends, and I'll admit, mine isn't much better. We followed the direction the voice had come from. There wasn't a clear trail, just a shallow dip through the trees, a place where the ground fell away a little and the needles lay thinner. We moved slowly, watching for signs, broken branches, a scrap of cloth, anything that would tell us this wasn't our imagination. About 10 minutes in, we found a line of stones set in the earth like a boundary. Not a wall, not a fence. Just stones, flat ones, placed end to end in a quiet curve, half buried as if they'd been there long enough for the forest to start swallowing them. And on one of the stones, someone had carved the same symbol, circle, line. Owen touched it with his fingers. "Okay," he said softly. "Okay, that's deliberate." Beyond the stones, the woods felt different. The air seemed thicker, as if the sound didn't carry the same way. Even the birds were quieter. We walked another few minutes and then stopped at the edge of a clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a small cabin, too small to be a house, too solid to be a shed. It looked built from old timber, darkened by time and smoke. The roof was made of weathered boards held down by stones. A thin line of soot stained the chimney, and on the front porch, right beside the door, sat a second lantern, identical to ours. The door opened before we could decide whether to knock. A man stepped out. He looked ordinary, not in a disappointing way, but in a way that made everything more unsettling. He wasn't a wild-eyed hermit. He wasn't some dramatic figure wrapped in furs. He was middle-aged with a tired face and a calm posture. He wore a heavy jacket and boots that had seen too many seasons. His hair was dark with a streak of grey at the temple. His hands were rough. His eyes were the kind of eyes that had watched a lot of nights. He took one look at us and nodded, like he'd expected us. "You camped at the ring," he said. It wasn't a question. Owen swallowed. "We did. We found the lantern." The man's gaze flicked toward the clearing behind us, toward the direction of the ridge. Did it light? I felt my mouth go dry. Yes. He exhaled slowly through his nose, as if that confirmed something he'd hoped was untrue. "Then the ridge is open," he said again. Owen let out a nervous laugh. "What does that even mean?" The man stepped off the porch and walked to the edge of the clearing. He didn't come close enough to be threatening. He kept distance, like a person who respects boundaries. "Come here," he said, and his voice wasn't commanding. It was protective, the way you talk to someone about to step into traffic. We moved, and he pointed up through the trees toward the ridgeline. In daylight, it looked harmless. Blue sky, pine tops, a gentle line of stone and soil. But the man's eyes stayed serious. "There are nights," he said, "when the ridge acts like a door. Not a door you can see, a door you can feel. Some people feel it as restlessness. Some feel it as curiosity. Some don't feel it at all." Owen glanced at me as if to say, "This is crazy." The man continued like he hadn't noticed. When it's open, things cross. Not monsters, not ghosts." He paused. "Most of the time, it's just travellers, lost ones, sometimes ideas, sometimes memories that don't belong where they are." I couldn't tell whether he believed every word or whether he was reciting something he'd learned the hard way. "What does the lantern do?" I asked. The man looked at me like he was relieved someone had asked the right question. "It marks you," he said. "It tells the ridge you're awake." Owen's face tightened. "That's not good." The man's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Not always. Being awake isn't bad. It's just noticeable." He walked back to the porch and picked up the lantern there. He held it out to us without moving closer. "You left yours on the rock," he said. "Good. Don't bring it into your tent. Don't hang it. Don't carry it down the trail. Leave it where it belongs." Owen frowned. Why would someone leave it there in the first place? The man's eyes went distant, as if he was looking at a night a long time ago. "Because," he said quietly, "that's how you tell the ridge you mean no harm. You give it light, but you don't take the light with you. You let it be a signal, not a possession." The forest around us was still. Even the wind had softened, as if it was listening too. Owen cleared his throat. "So, what happens tonight?" The man's gaze lifted toward the ridgeline again. "Tonight," he said, "we keep the lanterns steady, and we don't go wandering." He glanced at us, and for the first time his expression warmed. "And you," he added, "you either pack up and leave before sundown, or you sit by your fire and listen, and you do exactly what I said last night." "Don't move?" Owen asked. The man nodded once. "Don't move," he confirmed, "because the ridge doesn't care who you are. It only cares whether you're awake enough to notice it." We went back to our campsite with a strange feeling in our chests. Not pure fear, not pure curiosity, but a mixture that made both of those emotions sharper. Owen kept glancing over his shoulder, like he expected the trees to rearrange themselves when he wasn't looking. I kept thinking about the word the man had used, noticeable. It's an uncomfortable word to apply to yourself. In the city, you can be awake at 3 in the morning and nobody cares. Lights are always on somewhere. Cars still move. Phones still buzz. But on Pineglass Ridge, waking up felt like lighting a flare. We spent the afternoon doing what campers do when they're trying to stay calm. We made the campsite neat. We hung food away from the tent. We stacked wood. We boiled water for coffee, even though it was warm enough not to need it. We moved our bodies in circles, pretending the circles were productive. And all the while, the lantern sat on the rock, unlit, innocent-looking. Sometimes I'd catch myself staring at it like it might blink. Owen tried to laugh about it. "Maybe it's like local folklore," he said, throwing a stick onto the fire. "You know, beware the haunted ridge. Guy in the cabin spooks hikers for fun." "Maybe," I said, but the word didn't land with any conviction. The cabin man had seemed tired, not playful, protective, not theatrical. As evening came on, the ridgeline turned dark against the sky. The wind picked up in small gusts that carried the smell of pine resin and distant stone. The temperature dropped the way it does at altitude, fast with no warning. We ate in silence, and the silence wasn't awkward. It was heavy. It sat between us like a third person. At some point, Owen asked, "What time is it?" I checked my phone. 9:20. He nodded like that was useful information, and then he stared at the fire again. So we're just going to sit here? I guess, I said. We both knew we weren't leaving. Not anymore. Not after we'd met the lantern keeper. Not after the word open had entered the story. Something in us wanted to see if it was real. That's the dangerous thing about humans. We'll risk comfort for a satisfying answer. The stars came out bright and sharp. The kind of stars that make you realize how much sky you forget exists. The Milky Way looked like spilled salt. Owen's shoulders loosened a little. "Okay," he said softly. "This part is worth it." For a while, it was peaceful, just fire and trees and the soft hush of the ridge. If the story had ended there, it would have been one of those trips you remember fondly, one you talk about like a reset button. Then, at 11:43, the lantern lit. No flare, no sputter, just a calm ignition, like it had been waiting for a cue. Owen's hand froze halfway to his mug. The fire popped, and the sound seemed too loud. The trees creaked gently. Somewhere far away, an owl called once, and then went quiet. The lantern's glow made a small circle on the rock, a warm amber pool that looked almost like liquid honey. And in that circle of light, dust motes moved, drifting slowly as if time had thickened. I remembered what the man said. "Keep it steady." Owen whispered, "Do we do anything?" "Nothing," I whispered back. "We don't move." That's what we did. We stayed still. The first sign wasn't a shape or a shadow. It was a sensation. The ridge felt closer, like the air had folded inward. Then came the sound. Not footsteps in leaves, not snapping branches. Something softer, like fabric brushing fabric, like a coat sleeve moving past. It was behind the lantern, beyond the rock, in the direction of the trees. My eyes strained, trying to make meaning out of darkness. A figure stepped into the lantern's glow. For a half-second, my body tried to jerk backward, but I held it. Stillness. The figure was a person, not a monster, not an animal. A person wearing a long coat and a hat pulled low. Their face was turned slightly away, as if they were avoiding the firelight. They moved with a careful grace, like someone walking through a room where others were sleeping. They crossed the glow, and as they did, the lantern brightened. Just a fraction. Then the person stopped. They stood with their back to us and looked out over the ridgeline, toward the dark valley below. I couldn't see their eyes. I couldn't see their mouth. But I heard their breath. Slow, controlled, like someone trying to stay calm. Owen's fingers gripped the edge of his sleeping bag. I could see the tension in his knuckles, pale in the firelight. The figure lifted one hand and pointed into the trees, deeper than the lantern light could reach. And then, softly, so softly I almost thought it was the wind, they spoke. "Not yet," they said. Their voice wasn't threatening. It wasn't even directed at us. It sounded like they were speaking to the ridge itself, like they were negotiating. A second figure moved behind the first, faster, more restless. This one didn't step into the lantern's glow. It stayed in the edge of darkness, like it was afraid of the light. I felt something cold run through my chest. Not fear of harm, fear of being noticed, of being included. The second figure made a sound that wasn't a word. It was a hum, low and searching. The first figure turned their head slightly, as if listening, and said again, firmer, not yet. And then they did something that made my stomach drop. They turned toward us. The lantern light caught their face for a moment, and it was a face that looked almost familiar, like someone you've seen in passing at a train station. Ordinary features, tired eyes, but the expression was absent, not empty, just distant, like the person was standing in two places at once. They stared directly at us. Then the lantern keeper's rule made sense in a way I didn't like. The ridge cared whether you were awake enough to notice it, because if you noticed, it noticed you back. The person's lips moved. They didn't speak aloud, but I understood the sentence anyway, as if it had been placed directly inside my thoughts. Are you staying? My throat tightened. My mouth felt glued shut. Owen, without moving his head, whispered, "Don't answer." I didn't answer. The lantern's glow held steady, like a held breath. The person looked at us for one more long moment, and then their gaze drifted past us, toward the tent, toward the fire, toward the warmth, like those things were memories they could almost touch. Finally, they turned away. They stepped out of the lantern light and back into the trees. The second figure followed, restless, humming. The glow dimmed, slowly, like the lantern was satisfied. Only then did I realize I'd been holding my breath. I let it out in a quiet, trembling stream. Owen's eyes were wide. "What was that?" he mouthed. I shook my head very slightly. We stayed still for a long time after that. We didn't speak. We didn't move. We listened to the forest settle again. And far away, deeper in the trees, a faint metal clink echoed, like a lantern being set down on stone. We didn't sleep much after that. Not because we were shaking with terror, but because our minds wouldn't stop replaying the moment the figure looked at us. It wasn't a jump scare kind of fear. It was the slow, creeping realization that some places have rules you can't learn from a map. Owen and I took turns watching the lantern. That sounds ridiculous, I know, like guarding a lamp. But it felt necessary, like the lantern wasn't just light, it was a signal. Around 2:10, it lit again. This time the air shifted first, as if the forest made room for something. The lantern's amber glow spilled onto the rock, and the shadows at the edge of the trees sharpened. A figure appeared, then another, then another. Not all at once, one by one, spaced out like a quiet procession. They moved the same way, careful, deliberate, not stepping into the firelight if they could help it. Some wore coats. One wore a backpack. One wore a scarf that fluttered in the wind like it remembered a different city. They didn't look at us the way the first one had. They seemed preoccupied. Each person moved as if they were following directions only they could hear. Owen leaned close to my ear. His whisper was barely a thread. "They're people." "Yes," I whispered. The strangest part was how ordinary they were. No glowing eyes, no twisted shapes, no dramatic horror. Just humans moving through the night with an exhausted kind of purpose. One of them stopped near the lantern and placed a hand above it, palm down. like they were warming themselves. The lantern's light brightened slightly in response. The person didn't touch the lantern. They didn't pick it up. They just hovered, as if the warmth was enough. Then they looked up at the ridgeline and sighed. An actual sigh, the kind someone makes after a long day. And then they walked on. Another traveller paused and glanced toward our fire. Their face was half lit by the lantern glow. Their eyes didn't hold menace. They held longing. They took a small step toward us. Owen's whole body went rigid. I remembered the rule. Don't move. The traveller stepped closer. 1 step, 2. And then the wind changed. Not in a dramatic gust, just a shift. The smoke from our fire drifted sideways, and for a second it passed between us and the traveller's face, blurring it. When the smoke cleared, the traveller had stopped. They looked confused, as if they'd forgotten why they'd approached. Then they turned away and continued into the trees, heading down a faint slope that didn't exist in daylight, heading toward something only the ridge could show them. Owen's whisper was shaky. "Where are they going?" "I don't know," I said, but I had a guess. I'd heard the phrase before, in a completely different context. Thin places, locations where the world feels less solid, where the line between here and somewhere else isn't a wall, but a curtain. Pineglass Ridge wasn't haunted in the classic sense. It wasn't full of ghosts rattling chains. It felt more like a crossing, a station. And these people were travellers, not dead, not alive in the way we were. Something in between. They came through when the ridge was open. They followed the lantern light like it was a lighthouse. They moved on when they could. And we were sitting there, awake enough to be seen. At 3:17, the lantern flared brighter than it had all night. The travellers stopped. All of them, like a group listening for a sound. Silence fell so hard it felt physical. Even the fire seemed to hush. Then we heard footsteps behind us, real ones, solid, crunching needles. The lantern keeper stepped into the edge of our firelight. He moved calmly, like he'd done this 100 times. He didn't look surprised to find us awake. He looked prepared. He didn't speak at first. He just crouched near the fire and held his hands out, not too close to the flame. His face looked older in the firelight, more lined, more tired. He nodded toward the lantern and the travellers. "You're seeing it," he said quietly. Owen finally broke. "What is this?" The keeper's gaze stayed on the ridge. "A passage," he said, "not always open. But when it is, it draws the restless. It draws the unfinished." "Are they dangerous?" I asked. The keeper shook his head once. "Not by intent," he said. "But intent doesn't matter much when someone is lost." He glanced at me. "Have you ever been awake at night and felt like your life was happening somewhere else? Like you missed a turn and didn't notice?" I swallowed, because yes, everyone has felt that. "That feeling," he said, "is a kind of calling. Most people ignore it. Some follow it. When the ridge is open, it becomes louder." He stood and walked toward the lantern. The travellers didn't back away. They simply watched him with that distant, tired attention. The keeper raised one hand, palm outward, like a gentle stop sign. And then he spoke. Not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly. "Not tonight," he said. The lantern's glow steadied. The travellers shifted, uneasy. One of them, someone with a scarf, took a half-step forward. The keeper turned his head toward them, and his voice softened. "You can rest," he said, "but you cannot stay." The scarf traveller's expression changed in a way that made my chest ache. It wasn't anger, it wasn't fear, it was relief. As if someone had finally told them the rules in a language they could understand. They nodded once, slowly. Then they stepped back into the trees. The others followed one by one, fading into darkness like figures walking out of a spotlight. When the last one disappeared, the lantern dimmed. The keeper walked back to our fire and sat on a log like he belonged there. Owen looked like he didn't trust his own voice. "So you're, what, a guard?" The keeper gave a small, tired smile. "A keeper," he said. "Not of secrets, of boundaries." He poked the fire with a stick, making the coals glow. "People think the woods are empty," he said. "They're not. They're full of paths you can't see. Most nights, those paths lead nowhere. Some nights..." He looked up at the ridge line where the stars were starting to fade with approaching dawn. "Some nights," he finished, "they lead somewhere you don't want to go by accident." My voice came out small. "Why the lantern at our camp?" The keeper met my eyes. "Because you arrived at the ring," he said, "and the ring is a polite place to ask permission." Owen blinked. "Permission?" "To be awake here," the keeper said. "To sit with a fire and not be taken for a traveller." I stared at the lantern rock, suddenly understanding something that felt both simple and huge. The lantern wasn't bait. It was a sign that said, "We are here. We are not crossing." The keeper stood. "Dawn will close the ridge," he said. "When it does, you'll feel tired. Not scared. Tired." He started to walk away, then paused and turned back. "One more rule," he said. Owen and I both leaned in. The keeper's voice dropped lower, like a final instruction. "When you leave," he said, "don't take the lantern, and don't tell the ridge goodbye." He looked at us with the weight of someone who'd learned the wrong lesson once. "Just leave," he said, "quietly, like you were never here." Dawn didn't arrive like a trumpet. It arrived like a dimmer switch. The sky lightened slowly, and the stars slipped away. The ridgeline softened from black to charcoal to a muted green. And the moment the sun's first thin light touched the tops of the pines, the lantern went dark. Completely. Not a fade. Just off. Owen exhaled a breath he'd been holding all night without realizing. "So it's over," he said. I didn't answer right away, because the feeling in my body wasn't relief. It was exhaustion. The keeper had been right. Not scared, tired. Deep tired. The kind of tired that feels earned. The world looked normal again. The ring of stones around our fire looked like stones. The rock with the lantern looked like a rock. The trees looked like trees. But normal can be a mask. We packed slowly, not because we were afraid to move fast, but because we didn't want to break the quiet. We didn't speak much. We didn't joke. Even Owen, who usually fills silence with humor, seemed careful with words. The lantern sat on its rock, unlit, patient, as if it had never done anything remarkable. Owen stared at it for a long moment. We could take it, he said quietly. Not as a plan, but as a test. As proof. I felt a tightness in my chest, like the ridge itself had listened. No, I said immediately. We don't. Owen nodded. Yeah, he said, and his voice sounded like he was agreeing with something older than either of us. We shouldered our packs and stepped onto the trail. The first 10 minutes felt ordinary. Downhill through pines, needles underfoot. A few birds, a distant breeze. And then, without warning, I realized something. The forest sounded different. Not louder, not quieter, clearer. I could hear my own footsteps. I could hear Owen's breath. I could hear a faint trickle of water somewhere below, hidden but present. I could hear the soft squeak of my pack straps. The night on Pineglass Ridge had tuned my ears. Owen seemed to notice too. He stopped and listened, like a man who'd never realized sound could have layers. Do you feel that? He asked. Yeah, I said. He rubbed his face with one hand. It's like the world is sharper. We kept walking. The trail wound through a section of trees where the ground was thick with moss. The light filtered in pale and cool. It should have felt peaceful. But my mind kept replaying the travellers, their tired faces, the way they moved with purpose, the way one had almost stepped toward our fire. And I kept thinking about the question I didn't answer, spoken inside my head, not aloud. Are you staying? It bothered me, not because it was scary, but because it was tempting. Not the ridge, not the passage. The idea of staying in a place that felt significant, a place that made ordinary life feel thin. That's the danger of mysteries. They make the familiar look dull. We reached the stone boundary line again, the curved line of half-buried rocks. In daylight, it looked like an old garden edge, nothing more. Owen stepped over it. I did too. The moment my boot crossed the stones, the sharpness in the air eased. The forest's sound softened. The world became regular again, like a radio turning down the static. I stopped mid-step. Owen looked back. What? I swallowed. Nothing, I said. Just, it changed. Owen's eyebrows knit. He stepped back over the line and then forward again, testing it. His face shifted from confusion to quiet understanding. No way, he whispered. We stood there a moment, two adults on a hiking trail, stepping back and forth over a line of stones like kids on a sidewalk crack. But the effect was real. One side of the stones felt awake. The other side felt asleep. Finally, Owen stepped fully to the asleep side and stayed there. Okay, he said, almost to himself. Okay. We walked on. As the morning grew brighter, we came to a point where the trail opened onto a wide view of the valley. The world spread out below us. Distant roads, tiny roofs, a river catching light. The normal world busy and unaware. Owen sat on a boulder and stared. If we tell people, he said, they won't believe us. I shook my head. The keeper said not to. Owen frowned. Why? If it's dangerous, shouldn't people know? That's not what he said, I replied. He didn't say it was dangerous. He said, the ridge doesn't care, and if you talk about it, you make it louder. Owen chewed that over. I understood it in a way that made my stomach sink. Some places are like dreams. They exist best when you don't drag them into daylight. If you do, they either evaporate or they follow you home. We continued down until we reached the lower trailhead. Cars, gravel, the smell of warm rubber and sun-baked dust, a signboard with maps and safety reminders. Owen leaned his pack into the trunk and looked at me. "So, what do we do now?" he asked. I didn't know how to answer, because the truth was, something had changed. Not the world. Us. We'd sat by a fire and watched the ridge open, and we'd learned a rule that felt like it belonged in more places than just a mountain. There are nights you can't sleep because your mind won't stop traveling. And there are nights you can't sleep because something else is traveling through you. Owen closed the trunk. The sound echoed in the ordinary air. We drove away. And for weeks afterward, whenever I woke at 3:17, because yes, it happened, I didn't panic the way I used to. I didn't grab my phone. I didn't wrestle the pillow. I just lay still and listened. Not for travelers. Not for lantern light. Just for the soft, steady sounds that remind you the world is moving, whether you chase it or not. Sometimes the best thing you can do at night is this. Let the ridge stay on the ridge. Let the lantern sit on its rock. And let your thoughts pass through like travelers who don't need a destination, because you're not staying, not tonight. And that simple decision, quiet, steady, unannounced, can be the door that finally closes.